Thank you. So I'd just like to thank you all for having me here and for participating in our training this morning. Let me just run a little bit about who I am and what I do. I'm a clinical psychologist, currently practicing about half-time at the Shingle Springs Tribal Health Clinic in California here. Our service area is pretty much Sacramento and El Dorado counties, so we have kind of a large service area of folks. I'm also a past member of, well, I've been involved in many projects, but I'm also a past member of the National Advisory Committee and then the TEG Group Subcommittee, which Technical Expert Group Subcommittee of the Governing Board of SAMHSA. So in that, we were able to kind of impact many policies, but more importantly, we impacted the thinking, right? Sometimes it's not necessarily policies you want to change, it's how people think. And for those of you who are clinicians, you will know that sometimes it's the way a person processes information that we want to achieve some reformation of. And in many ways, we would hope to do that not only on a policy level, but at a practitioner level. So as we greet a native client coming into the room, we have some considerations that we would want to have in that. We want to be able to think about not only the person that is before us, but the family they represent, maybe the community they're from, maybe the tribe that they're from. So there are a lot of considerations, much like there are with anyone who comes from a diverse background, but there are additional impacts and considerations with Native people. So we want to go over some of those things today. Let me ask real quickly, how many people in the room are practicing clinicians? Okay, don't be shy. How many are case managers, social workers? Okay, quite a few. And then how about community service providers? Okay, any natural helpers? We're all natural helpers. Natural helpers do many of the same things that the rest of us do. It's just that they tend to also cook. So, you know, so I like going to natural helpers. As we talk today, what we'll find is that the lines between the level of service provider that we have, particularly within Native communities, become blurred very quickly. Why is that? Because in many ways, as we have in many cultural programs, we want to be able to have a constellation of efforts that serve to allow someone, that serve to allow change. Okay, so there's an old thinking that we used to have maybe in mental health, I'm not sure, that people had to come in a very kind of individualistic, kind of nuclear family approach to mental health. And hopefully those days are gone, I don't know. But what we're beginning to understand, it's that there's a network of wellness. And that the more, for many of our communities and many of our people who have, particularly people who have chronic disturbance, but others, it's engagement with that community of wellness that really begins to help them to reform or rethink who they are, right? One of the things that I often ask clients when we're first engaging and first talking about how we might be helpful for them, it's kind of a diagnostic question, but it's a very cultural question also. I ask where they're from. And then I also ask them, what's your family known for? Many people have to stop and think, you know, I don't know, my family. They're known for, you know, and they'll usually couch it in some manner, but some people will say things like, everyone's afraid of my family. That's good to know. Should I be is probably my first question. And then what I want to do is I wanted to be able to kind of get some concept with them about why that is. Why did you give that answer as opposed to some other answer? And what we're going to find is that there's this hidden message in the background, and that hidden message is because that's the way I am too, right? So if someone tells me everyone's afraid of my family, what are they telling me? Either that I'm going to grow up to be that way, or you should be afraid of me too. So that's something that is part of a communication. Many times children will give you the most honest answers. Isn't that interesting? Children will say things like, and by the way, many people will respond like, well, I guess my grandfather's known as a healer, so therefore that's probably what people know, my family for. Children will say things to me like, well, my family has a lot of singers in it, so a lot of people know my family because there's a lot of singers in my family, which is a specific role within the Native community. Other children will say, oh, everyone knows my family. We're the biggest drug dealers on the reservation. That's good to know. So it's interesting how honest someone can be with very simple questions. And we'll talk about some of those kind of entrance questions that we might have. The point is that in many ways, what you're going to find, the things that we talk about today are important in the treatment and engagement with Native people. But they're also skills that we would have in engaging and treating other diverse populations. So we're not really looking through a narrow scope as much as we are looking at major considerations that we should have in serving Native people, but also considerations we should have for treatment in general. We should know something about the history that people come from. We should also know that the more traumatic their history is, probably it impacts their ability to report that history. So if you have a traumatic, intergenerationally traumatic family history, it becomes a very hard thing to put into words. And so that may be one of the very things that we're trying to treat, is the ability to bring to the conscious impacts of trauma that have existed intergenerationally. And as we do that, I always like to begin with just a recognition, with just a thought, and I'd like you to join me in this. I do this because we have lost many families. Our people in California, and I'm going to talk specifically about California because, by the way, I'm Chumash, originally from California. I come from the Santa Ynez area of California, and our people in California, the Native people that you see, have had a unique experience. Whether they are from tribes within the state or from without the state, their experience is very unique and different from tribes that, let's say, are in the Midwest. Okay, even though they might be from those tribes. We're going to talk about some of that today. But I also I want to and need to recognize the fact that there are many children and there are many elders amongst our people that are just not here today. They're not here in this room. They're not here in our community. They're not amongst us. Because we still struggle today with the very issues at some level, the very issues that we had 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Those issues have not stopped. We're going to talk a little bit about that process. As we talk about Native wellness and Native mental health issues, it's important for us to understand that as a people, as Native people, we come to engagement, at least in mental health services, but in many things, with a concept of how we are currently and how we were meant to be. In many ways, in the Native perspective, that sense of not understanding or not having a concept of how you were meant to be, in and of itself can define a mental problem or a problem of the spirit. And so it's a very different way of looking at things. We tend to think of mental health issues or mental problems or psychological issues. There are many, words in the English language for this, as something that people carry within them, but they carry within their thoughts, right? In a native perspective, we view these as issues or problems that someone carries within their heart. And so it's a very different perspective. It's a perspective of change that comes from deep within, as opposed to a cognitive process of change. The cognitive process is also important, though. And it's the bringing of those two kind of conceptual frameworks together that is a part of our change. Okay? So we'll talk a little bit about things like the medicine wheel, where we talk, well, let me talk real quickly. The medicine wheel, basically, if you've ever seen a medicine wheel, we have 4 quadrants, one for each direction. And in the medicine wheel, we tend to think of, depending on what tribe you're from, each one represents different things, but they also represent different things within ourselves. And those things within ourselves are the spiritual, the mental, the emotional, and the physical. And so it's that confluence of things, that confluence of our perspectives of ourselves that come together that make wholeness. So when we talk about wellness, we're talking about something that's different than a state policy, right? We're talking about, when we talk about wellness, what we're talking about is that holistic convergence of those very issues to make us whole again. Importantly, with Native people, those issues are not always held in this perspective of ourselves. It's not an individualistic process. We tend to think of that in the process as part of an effort of community and as an effort of family. So many times people may come to therapy and they will say things like, I want to do this for my family. And too many times, what do we hear therapists say? No, you have to do it for you. I'm sorry. Come back when you're ready. That doesn't work, right? And it doesn't work for many people, by the way. What they're saying to you is that I'm too humble to be able to say that I would do this for myself. That would be a selfish thought process for me. And so I'm doing this for my family because that's acceptable to me. I can do it with that motivation in mind. Also, what you'll find is many Native people, as do many other clients, come to counseling because maybe there has been a referral. Someone has said, you need to go to counseling. My grandmother is making me come here. Darn it. Well, if she was only here, we could treat her, No, what they're telling you is that I couldn't get past that stigma, right? So someone's making me come here. That's okay. What they're saying to you is that this counseling would not probably have been my first way to go, but it does have utility for me. And that utility is essential in treatment. So, as many of us know, the process of change is important if we want to have internalized change, right? If we want to do something for ourselves. But for many of our people, it must also have external utility. In other words, it has a function in my life that's going to help me to get forward. And that function can be very simple. I need to get off probation, right? I need to get my drug and alcohol counselor off my back about going to counseling. I need to address issues of my family, right? Those are expressions that I believe that this counseling can help me to solve a part of my life. Okay, so they are not masks because we tend to think of them that way, right? We tend to think of them as, oh, well, You know, if you're coming for the judge, I don't know. Have them call me. No, that's not what they're saying. What they're saying is that there's a utility in me being here, as there's a function in me being here, as well as the process of me wanting to change. Okay. Remember that in our societies as Native people, we existed for thousands and thousands of years. And, you know, they argue about, was it 35,000? Was it 50,000? Was it 25,000? You know, I guess we can split hairs about it, give or take a $10,000 year period of time. As Native people, we can, in our own histories and our own legends, if you refer to those legends, they will tell you exactly how long we've been here. And they will tell you exactly that there were people that have been here from the beginning of time, and that there are people that migrated here. And it's within their stories. In Southern California, we have bird songs. And bird songs are part of a tradition of many tribes throughout the Southwest. Certain tribes have bird songs and certain tribes don't. And I often, growing up around that, I often wondered, you know, like, well, how come they have bird songs and they don't have bird songs, and they seem to be neighbors, right? I found out later on there's a reason for that. The reason is that the bird songs, as the people were shown in creation, the bird songs are actually a creation story. They're singing the story. They're singing from one song to another. They're all in a certain order, and they're singing their story of creation. And they call them bird songs for many reasons, but one of them is that in coming to that land where the Creator intended them to be, there was a story that went with that. So many times you'll hear in those songs, if you understand the language, they'll tell you about how it was so cold, and that then we were told to move forward. Think very simple concepts like that. And we survived that. And you have to think, wow, you're from Arizona. I'm thinking it doesn't get all that cold in Arizona. No, they're from, you know, maybe Canada, right, or wherever. But we're talking about histories of people that go back 20,000 years. That these songs, these customs and traditions go back that far. Okay. I've had the advantage of visiting a site in Canada that is hardly ever recognized, but it is the longest lasting, continually used ceremonial site in the world. And the reason that it's the longest used ceremonial site in the world, and it's a UN protected site. So there's a big museum there, and it's part of a UN property. The reason that is there is that there are cliffs there. And so to have large groups, large nations of people come together in ceremony, what would you need? You need food. How are you going to get food? We run the buffalo off the cliff, we got a lot of food. Right? So this was the longest in history, all the history of the world. This is the longest used ceremonial site that there is. So we had customs that defined our roles with one another. Those customs allowed us to represent our family, represent our community, and represent our tribe. And that is how we moderated our behavior, okay, by whom we represented. So you had to be, let's say, a good person because you came from a certain family. And if you didn't represent that family well, where'd we get back to them? Or people would think that your family was that way. Or they might have a wrong impression of you or your family or your ways together. So do you see how subtle that is? Those very concepts eliminated our need for police, eliminated our need for courts. Come on in, Latimer. And eliminated our need for prisons. That's pretty powerful, right? If we could only do that today. And so we're raised in this, traditionally, we're raised in this thought process of agreement, that we respect our families, that we respect our elders, and that we respect the community, the tribe, the traditions that we come from. Many times the reformation of people who are having problems within their life comes back to that very process of finding who you are and how you were meant to be. And so these are some of the things that we try to find the ember that still exists and feed that fire in therapy. So our concepts of family and our concepts of community can also be at some level diagnostic. For instance, if I say, I can tell you many stories, but if I were to tell someone, tell me about your family, tell me about your sense of your family, tell me about your community, tell me about your traditions, and they say things to you like, well, I don't know any of those things, and I don't want to know any of those things, or my family, I don't know those people, right? They've told me something very important about themselves, haven't they? They've told me that, okay, so I want to know why, by the way, but assuming that that family comes from a fairly healthy background, that there's something going on with this individual that makes them not fit in well with that. And maybe that's what we're here to address, right? It may not be that their spouse doesn't understand them. That may not be the biggest part of the problem. And so that concept of that many of us were raised with, of make a good family, come from a good community, show your people to be people of honor, are important concepts within the Native community. And our beliefs are grounded in ways that we were given in the beginning of time. So they go back that far. And many times what you'll find traditionally is that elders will tell people, we're not supposed to be that way. That's one of the worst things you could be told when I was growing up. There were two things that you could be told that would tell you you were really going off the beaten track. You're in trouble, is what they're saying. One is, that's really not our way. Like, oh, darn it. The other one was, it's up to you. You can do what you want. That's even worse. That's when your elders are saying, basically, we're giving up on you. You just do whatever you want because you're not going to listen to us anyway. So do you see how subtle that is? And also how fragile that is. So let's say someone brings something into that mix of something like alcohol abuse or drug abuse. And an elder tells them, you're free to do whatever you want. I'm okay with it. Right? I still love you. Yay! Right? That means I can drink, I can use drugs to my heart's content. Well, you see, they've just kind of looked over that whole thing of respect because they have a bigger issue. And so it's very fragile communications that we're talking about. These communications don't only exist in Native communities, they exist in many communities, don't they? Sometimes they're not even verbal. It's by the way people act toward one another or position themselves toward one another. Those are subtle cues. Then we have an impact of assaults and what I consider also insults upon culture that have happened within our Native people. And these are very important to understand. Without understanding the intergenerational history that Native people kind of come to the table with, then it's very hard for us to truly understand what it is we're treating. Okay. How many of you are somewhat familiar with the history of Native people within your own area? Okay, so you have some level of understanding. How many of you feel that that didn't quite go well? Yeah, that didn't go well, did it? Unfortunately, it continues to not go well today. Okay. And so what I'd like to do is talk about the waves of assaults that have happened upon Native people in our communities here in this area. This area was a big battleground initially for Native people, and all of the surrounding mountains were very, very important historically to Native people. It is important to understand that because it's important to understand the issues that someone brings into the room when they show up, that you may or may not be aware of. So the first of these waves that we had of assault upon our culture, in California anyway, was the missionary period. And in the missionary period, what we found was that people came to our land and said, you know, we believe a certain way, and you should too. We're okay with that. But then it became a little more than that. It became a form of believing in a certain manner, or we will destroy your village, or we will kill your family, or we'll just plain enslave you until you decide different, which was the case in most cases in the mission areas. It also had a rippling effect upon other communities that the missions weren't even a part of, and that is that it kind of drove people away, because that was a threat that you could be captured and put into a mission environment. So tribes and communities began to move, whole communities, which, as you can imagine, if you took the town of Lathrop, let's say, and said, okay, folks, we all got to move, that would not be such an easy thing to do. So the missionary period began to enslave our people, right? To begin to construct monuments, missions, monuments, buildings, other things, that were of some utility in a way that we didn't understand. The only thing that we understood was that it had to do with a way of belief that wasn't ours. Okay? And so, in many of our ways, initially Native people thought that European people worshipped buildings, right? Some of that's still true, I think. How many of you in government have dealt with brick and mortar thinking, okay? We'll build a building, it'll be better, you know. Well, no, it won't. So, you know, the whole concept of that they must believe that these monuments, these buildings that they build, was somehow, that's what they believe in. So it was very foreign initially. And with that came a tradition or a practice of internalized oppression, which came initially from being treated like slaves. Past that, how many of you have heard that, by the way, before in some context, or knew that? Did most of you know that? Okay. Now take a second, for those of you that knew that, and ask yourself, when I was in elementary school, did we celebrate missions? If you went to school in California, you did, right? We celebrated missions, right? If you go to elementary school in California today, do they celebrate missions? Think about the impact that has on a Native child that's going to school, that knows they very well know that history, by the way, that is saying, we're going to celebrate something that, oh, by the way, caused a huge impact on your people, right? And we're going to honor that. And if you don't honor it, you might not make it in this class, right? So as you can see, now they have the parents helping them build a mission, right? And out of sugar cubes or something. So what kind of impact does that have on a child? Do you see how it continues to happen? It's a little bit like having a home where there was domestic violence. And you get some distance from the violent perpetrator, but all anyone can talk about is how good life was with him. Would you recommend that in counseling? Probably not, right? And as a matter of fact, if someone did that, if a parent did that, you'd probably think they have major issues we need to address. Why? Because they're continuing to kind of inadvertently victimize their children by honoring this perpetrator. But yet this is a common experience for Native children today. In many of our history books, it's not just about missions, right? There are many things we celebrate. We still celebrate Custer's Last Stand in some books, in some classes. There are many things that are kind of sidelines to history that are talked about that are huge issues for Native people. And we grow up within that context. We grow up within the context of being less than because we're not recognized. You see, we don't recognize that would be an issue for you. So we must not care about you too much, right? We would recognize that would be an issue for you if we respected you. I guess we don't respect you. We would recognize the issues of land that exist for you if we respected you. But we don't. So it's a very clear communication to children from a very young age of where they stand in the world. Okay. Then we came to a period of, and these two kind of came together, but there's a distinction. Because we went through a period in California where we were hunted for bounty. Okay. Being hunted for bounty seems like something that, oh yeah, that might have happened in the 1700s or it might have happened in the 1800s maybe. We have people alive today that have recollections of being hunted for bounty. Okay. I have one of my favorite stories to tell, and I'm trying to not get emotional this time. An elder of mine, a gentleman who I have a lot of deep respect for, he talks about when he was, and I actually hope he's still alive because I haven't seen him in a few years. He talked often about when he was being raised. He was raised by his grandmother, and it was just him and his grandmother. It was kind of cool, really. But he was raised by his grandmother, and they lived way up in the mountains. And he talks vividly about his recollections of growing up because, so it must have been a good childhood for him. He talks about how they lived in a traditional house, right? And it was a little bit in the ground because that's the way some of our houses are. And he talks about how they had a dirt floor, and it was a one-room house, of course. And they have a dirt floor, and every day, and anyone who's ever lived in a house that has a dirt floor knows, interestingly enough, that you sweep the floor every day. Other people go, why would you do that? It's dirt. We want good quality dirt, okay? So we don't want just that other stuff that's dusting around. And there's a whole process. You got to sprinkle the water and you got to do things. And he would talk about how his grandmother would do that, almost with pride. Like, she was such a neat person, right? She had everything, and they had a kitchen, right? They'd bring water in. They had a kitchen. They cooked in there. And he talked about how at night she would lay him down. They went to bed kind of early because they didn't have TV or anything. And she would lay him down and she would sing to him. And then most times he would go to sleep during that process, but many times he didn't. He would just lay there. And he would always watch her because she's just on the other side of the room. And she would start to clean. And she would clean all her dishes. And he said, the thing is that we didn't use those dishes. You see, she had a set of dishes that were nice. They were kind of, for her anyway, there was china, right? And he said, the thing I remember from my childhood is my grandma took each one of those dishes every night. And she washed them. And then she'd wrap them up in flour sacks, right? Each one of them. And she put them in a burlap bag. Now, we had cupboards, right? But she put them in a burlap bag. And she hung that burlap bag on the door. And he was respectful, and he never asked why that was, right? Until she was getting very elderly and she was kind of reaching the point of passing away. And he asked her, he says, Grandma, I remember when you did that. And she goes, oh, yeah, I remember, I used to always do that. He said, why did you do that? What was that about? She said, well, I had to hang our dishes because those are the most valuable things we had. They were things I wanted to make sure we saved those. And he would say, saved from what? She said, well, that was in case the white people came to kill us. And we had to run in the middle of the night. We would be able to grab our dishes. Right? He was raised that way. He was raised in a constant fear that at any given time, someone could show up in the middle of the night and kill them. He's still alive today, right? He's an elder of ours. So that tradition still lives on. Some of you, I just noticed, walked in the room, work with the Washoe tribe. And I started the Washoe Family Healing Center, Trauma Healing Center. And we would treat children throughout Nevada, actually, that had childhood trauma events or issues happen within their lives. And treating Washoe children and children throughout that part of Nevada was a little bit different than treating children from other tribes. Why was that? Does anyone have a guess why that might be? Okay, well, let me tell you. Washoe children, as they were growing up, were told by their elders, you have to be very good children. If you're not good children, the white people will come and take you away from us. Because that's what they did to me. Right? For the most part, for many people. Many of their children were removed, put in boarding schools or other things. They said, but if you go to a white foster home, they will cook you and eat you. They were raised that way. Where'd they get that? Because you see, the Washoe people are the people from the Lake Tahoe area. The Lake Tahoe, Gardnerville, Nevada, that whole area. When the Donner Party was one of the first group of people coming across the mountains, they actually went and sat on the mountains and looked at them. And they watched them and they said, these people are crazy. They're eating each other. We don't know why. Why don't they just come down off the mountain? That must be their belief. That must be what they do. We better tell our children because we don't want them to get captured by one of these people. Right? And so that became a very strong tradition or vein within their stories that you have to be very careful about being around the white people because they will kill you and they'll eat. Can you imagine what it was like growing up with a child? Now you get removed from your home and put in a white foster home. Oh my God, these kids wouldn't sleep for days because they were so terrified that someone was going to kill them in the middle of the night. That exists today. We're not talking about 100 years ago. We're not even talking about 50 years ago. That happens today. So the impact of things that we don't think about because we're kind of wrapped up in our modern experience impact us. in ways that we're not always aware of. So one of the other issues that occurred is the military attacks. Oh, by the way, does anyone know why you probably don't, I'll just tell you. People were hunted for bounty for a reason. Somebody just didn't come up one day and say, this would really be really cool. No, our people were hunted for bounty for a very simple reason, for the most part. And that is that the U.S. military troops that the government hoped would kind of exterminate native people to clear the land, they were busy doing something. They were fighting a civil war, right? There was no military to be found in many situations. And those that were engaged in some level of that civil war. So, in order to address the issue of wanting to clear the land of native people, they came up with the idea of, we have a lot of people coming into California. None of them have jobs. None of them have money. This would be a good way to solve that problem. So we're solving several problems by putting a bounty on native people. So you can imagine how low we were treated, right? Similar to a bounty they had at the time on skunks. It's a little bit more, but they had a bounty on skunks, and I'm not quite sure why that was, but they didn't. The major population of California hates skunks, apparently, because they keep running over them on the road too. Did you notice? I think that now the skunks just commit suicide. So, that's just my thought. I don't know. So when the Civil War ended, it was a very deliberate change in policy that happened. That now that the Civil War has ended, now we have military people all over the place, right? People wearing uniforms, one side or the other. And we have a military, industrial-driven economy at that point, because so much of the effort had gone into the Civil War. Well, now the economy is dependent upon this military kind of complex that's existed, and we have to find something for them to do. So what shall we do? Let's deal with what was at that time called the Indian problem. And so all of the wars that you hear that happened, the Indian Wars and all that stuff in the Midwest, those happened right after the Civil War. Why? Because they had a military that was geared up and that needed something to do, basically. And so they began to attack native nations in an effort to clear them of the land also, and to force them into treaties or submission, whatever that might be. In California, we have a tradition or a way in California, remembering that our people in our history, the history that we know of amongst our people goes back probably about 10,000 years that's within our memory. Okay? So stories and traditions tell us that history. In all of that history in many of our tribes in California, there was never such a thing as war. Can you imagine that? Thousands and thousands of history, they never had a war. Years of history. Why was that? Our villages, one of the things that anthropologists have found out is that our villages were very distinct in their culture and their language from village to village. You could go 20 miles down the road and be in an almost completely distinct culture from what you were in 20 miles before. What anthropologists tell us is that means that those villages, those people, had been living in that kind of a situation, in a very static and stable situation, for thousands and thousands of years. It takes that long for that to occur. And that there must have been very low conflict between the people. So we had a secret weapon, though. And that secret weapon are different things, but generally throughout today, what you find, we still do this. We have either gambling games or what in some communities we call stick games, there's gambling games, but then there's also stick games. And stick games are a way of resolving conflict between villages. So if one village got really mad at another village, or one family got really mad at another family, the duel that they would have would be to challenge them to a stick game. And these are fairly violent games, but there's only 3 or 4 players. And whoever won, well, they had the bragging rights. So whatever conflict there was, the other family or the other village could not speak of that conflict anymore. Right? If we could only do that today. So we had military attacks on our communities that then took things to a whole new level of violence upon our people. What happened to many of our people at that point is that because the military had many resources, they could go way up into the mountains if they needed to. Our villages and our tribes had begun kind of pushed up into those mountains. And what happened was that the military was able to follow them. And they were pretty good at hiding. They knew the area. But at some point, disease began to take over. And that disease that really was the cause for the loss of our lands in many areas throughout the country began to weaken people. And so families began to split off and say, we just need to take care of ourselves here. And they would find their way into cities and towns, and they would kind of blend in with the population there, hoping that they wouldn't be found or killed. And so what happened is you have this kind of trained mechanism of people becoming a part of a larger population of people. They would pass off as being any number of things, Chinese, because there were a lot of Chinese here at that time, Hispanic, of various nationalities, but Mexican was one, and then and other things. There were actually a lot of Hawaiians here at that time. So they would begin to blend into the community. And there are rich stories throughout California of how families survived. Many of them are very proud of how they survived. Many of them, it's not just a family's history, it's an entire tribe's history, that blending in and that surviving. Some of them went to missions, thinking that they had relatives there, or they knew people there, or at least they knew how to get there, and that at least they would be safe. And so that also occurred. Can you imagine how that affects, the rippling effect that would have upon families? That there's a whole tradition built around running, around staying safe, not feeling safe in most environments, and by the way, being victimized at every turn. We don't want to downplay the violence that existed. That violence included rapes, it included various levels of assault, it included murders, and it included a tactic that was often used by bounty hunters and by the military, which is actually there are many conventions against this internationally now, that what they would do is shoot to wound, not shoot to kill. Why? Because it takes many more people, right, to care for someone who's wounded. And when someone's wounded, they knew that their family and their village would come down when those folks no longer were apparent, that those families and communities would kind of come down to help that person. That's how they got them out of their hiding places and to then be killed. So all of these tactics to kind of eliminate and annihilate a people, we've lived through that. And it continues at some level today. So the next wave that we had was the boarding school era. How many of you heard of that? You ever studied about that, heard about it? Okay, so in the boarding school era, basically our people were removed. This was done in other countries, by the way, also. But this was, the United States set the example. The United States was the first one to do it, and then other countries began to follow. And what would happen is that children would be removed from their villages, from their families, from their towns, and they would be kind of spirited off to these boarding schools, sometimes as young as 3 years old. And they would be raised in these boarding schools, which were very violent, military schools, which were run by the federal government. And these military schools had one thing in mind, and that was to kill the Indian, but save the person. Right? That was their credo, is kill the Indian, save the man. So any vestige of culture that you had, it was the school's mission to do away with that. Well, wait a minute now. Our culture, for probably most of us in this room, right? Our culture is kind of how we define and it's the foundation we stand on for being a healthy person, isn't it? I mean, wouldn't you agree? It's kind of how we decide what's right and wrong. It's kind of how we decide what's healthy and not healthy. It's also governs how we relate to one another. So if you're going to take all of that away, you've just robbed an entire people of a sense of their own wellness. That's pretty important. Many times these children would run away, and they'd run back to their villages and their communities. Interestingly enough, that I knew an elder. I've spent a lot of time with elders. I love elders. I knew an elder who died recently. His claim to fame in life, that everybody knew him for, was that he ran away from boarding school 9 times. Okay? And he made it back home every time. Till they finally got him, and then he didn't run away anymore. The boarding school that he ran away from was Sherman Indian School in Riverside, California. Still exists today. Okay? He was from the Hoopa area of northern Humboldt County. When he first ran away to get back home, he was 5.5 years old. That's why he was famous, right? He was 5.5 years old. He made his way back to northern Humboldt County because he was so desperate to be with his family. He did that 9 times. This is someone who was alive. Within, a few years ago, he was alive. The people, and he's actually a very highly respected tribal elder, or was a highly respected tribal elder there. And so, can you see how his story lives on, right, amongst our people? His grandchildren, they speak about that. I mean, there are some other things he was well known for, but that's a major part of him. But with this tradition of boarding schools came kind of a tradition of Native people not being entitled to their own children, not having entitlement to their own children. And so that era of removal of children through boarding schools was then replaced by an era of removal of children by social service agencies. So, as you can imagine, that takes on a whole new light, doesn't it? So now we have helping agencies, the agencies that we would hope would be helpful to people, taking over that role of being the perpetrators of violence against our people. And more importantly, the shadow that cast, that our people would see service providers as a source of risk, danger. When you have someone who enters in the room today as in therapy, they many times carry those issues with them. So this is a good time to stop and ask if there. What I'd like to ask is, imagine for a moment that you're from a family that has been not impacted by one of these things, but been impacted by all of these things. You have some history of each one of those within your family. How would you feel? How would you approach life? Would it be any different? Let me have some thoughts. What would that be? How do you imagine it would impact you?
You wouldn't trust anybody.
You wouldn't trust anyone, okay? We certainly wouldn't sign things. We have this big phobia about signing things.
You probably would want to isolate.
You'd want to isolate, right?
There'd be resentment and anger, certainly.
A great deal of anger. And you will find that in families that you treat. There's a great deal of undercurrent of anger. What else might we find?
Do your best to change it.
Right. So there are some that will say, you know, I can sit around and be angry or try to do something to myself to make me less angry. Or I can put that anger into trying to do something to make it better or change it. And that's important. That is actually a very resilient trait. Yes?
They become paralyzed in fear and they don't take risks.
Yes. A thinking that if I blend into the wall, right, then, and I don't take risks and I don't do anything, maybe they won't know I'm here. Right? Interesting story I once had. I've worked in many Native communities. And one of them was Bishop, California, right? How many of you know where Bishop, California is? Okay. Nice community, right? Nice place. What most people don't realize is that if you drive through Bishop from one side of town to the other, more than most of what you have driven through is the reservation, right? And so I was in Bishop, and I was consulting with some mental health. I think it was the mental health board actually that I was meeting with, and this woman, elderly, white woman, you know, part of the community. She said, "Oh, you know, it's so wonderful to see that some Native people are participating in this process with us." And I said, "Yeah, that's nice. You know, we would like to see more people from the reservation kind of get more involved in things." And she said, is there a significant population of Native people here?" And I said, "Well, yeah, there kind of is a large population of Native people here." She says, "I've never met one." I said, "Wow, really? Did you ever run into people who were dark or maybe look like me a little bit?" She goes, "Well, yeah, there's a lot of Hispanics around. Those people aren't Hispanic. But they will allow you to believe they're Hispanic. Why? So they'll be safe." Right? So all of these things are kind of behaviors. And with that, we have lost rights to our communities. Let's go over briefly some of the things that you will see. With the removal of Native children today, okay, let's bring this to the current day effects. With the removal of Native children today, you have a wholesale removal of Native children constitutes the wholesale forcible migration of children from one culture to another. That practice affected as many as 1 in 3 Native children. So around just prior to 1978, in most of our communities in California, 1 in 3 Native children was being removed from their homes. What made things change in 1978? Does anyone know? American Indian Movement. Yeah, but ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. And in the Indian Child Welfare Act, what Congress found was that Native children were being removed from their homes at an alarming rate, and that social services agencies were conducting this attack upon Native families. And they took steps to then protect the families from the social service agencies. And interestingly enough, what happened with that is that yet today, California is one of the least compliant states in the country with the Indian Child Welfare Act. Many of us think that California is very forward-thinking and, and so forth. In my experience, and I've been all over the country, some of the worst human rights violations against Native people come from California. It's a hotbed, basically, of issues. So if you think of 1 in 3 children, then virtually no family escaped it, did they? 1 in 3 children is a lot. We have large families. So there isn't really a Native person that either through their family experience or through their extended family hasn't experienced some removal of family members to somewhere outside their culture or home. By the way, in the removal of Native children, 85% of these children were placed in non-Indian homes.
Quick question.
Yes.
Can you expand just why California has such a awful tradition of...
Well, the two things. The only way I've made sense of it, because obviously it doesn't make sense, is that there's a tradition of kind of not recognizing the rights and the place and the rightful place, is the way I put it, of Native people to be here. Okay, that changed with the casinos, right? Because we like casinos, so we'll let them be here for casinos. And by the way, now that you have casinos, you don't have any more problems, right? Oh, there are such a small number of people that participate in casino revenues. It's incredible. Our best guess is that it's probably less than, around 5% of the total Native population. Less than 5%. And that number actually becomes smaller, which is interesting. Why would it become smaller? Well, it becomes smaller because the investors in casinos are very comfortable with dealing with one small group of people. They don't want to be dealing with a big, giant group of people that has a lot of politics and things can change and so forth. So they encourage what's called disenrollment, which means that people begin to say, well, that family's not really from here anyway. So why are they on our rolls? Why are they participating in this per capita money? So we kick them off, right? And they will tell you that that's because that's what the tribe wanted. That becomes no clearer than in the Anderson Rancheria, which is the Wintun, one of the large Wintun rancherias. They had a change in tribal council. They disenrolled 55% of the membership because that's what the membership wanted. Somebody in the background stood up, raised their hand, and said, wait a minute. If that's what the membership wanted and you disenrolled 55% of them, that doesn't make sense. But in fact, that's what they did. And those people, one of the large families, by the way, said, we're not leaving. We're not going anywhere. We're members of this nation. We're staying here. And there's a huge battle going on about that. The other situation in California that exists, so you have this kind of tradition of kind of mowing over the Native rights and not recognizing them. But the other thing that happens in California is that lack of recognition comes from the lack of there being large reservations in California to some extent. You have to think about that a moment. There are, I think right now we're about at 1/4 of all the tribes, is that right, in the United States are from California. 1/4 of all the tribes in the United States are from California. That's a lot. Why is that? Well, in the late 1800s, actually the mid-1800s, the United States signed treaties with the tribes in California. They set aside large sections of the state, large reservations, because there were so many native people in California, as those reservations. Huge areas, one of the reservations extended almost all the way from the coast. If you think of the coastal range between Bakersfield and Los Angeles, it extended along that range almost all the way to Nevada. Okay, that's a big, large piece of country. And there were other large reservations throughout California. Those treaties were signed. They were signed in good faith. They were signed by the U.S. officials, and they were signed by the native people. Congress never ratified them, because by the time Congress began to consider those, gold had been discovered in California. And so they decided that, these lands might have gold on them. We don't want to be giving them away to native people, because they could have gold too. So basically, all in one fell swoop, all the native people, by the way, had migrated to these reservations because they were told that's what they were to do. And in one fell swoop, oh, by the way, you can go back home now. There is no such thing as a reservation. And we've actually given this land to other people. So huge issues around that. What happened is that there was a law passed called the Homeless California Indian Act, which said that since we don't have reservations, we have to come up with a different plan. And what we'll do is we'll map out the villages and the family lots that we know of, which, by the way, they didn't know of very many because people didn't want to be attacked. And so the ones we know of, we will set that little piece of property aside as a little reservation, or what was called rancheria. Okay, that's why you have so many rancherias. Also, in the state of California, there was a policy at the same time that happened that said, we do not recognize the tribes or the nations of California. We do not recognize their right to exist as a people. And so therefore, we will recognize bands of that tribe, but never recognize the nation itself. In this area, one of the tribes you have in this area is the Miwok tribe. If the Miwok tribe was recognized by the federal government as one tribe, they'd be one of the largest tribes in the country. So they would be at least as many as the Navajo Nation, right? So there is that difference. So the attacks and the assaults upon the family continue today. How does that continue, or how is that expressed? Well, violent crimes is probably the major expression of that. Oh, actually, let me back up. Removal of children is a major expression of that. We still have, depending on whose statistics you read, 1 of 5 or 1 of 4 Native children being removed from their homes. 20 years, I'm sorry, how many years has it been since the Indian Child Welfare Act? About 25 years almost? I don't know. My math's no good. Okay, so it's been a long time. 30-something years, okay, since the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And one of the areas that is considered the worst offender, of course, is the state of California. Okay. So it's considered to be higher in California. Also, we have violent crimes against Native people. Native American men and women are victimized at a rate 52.3 per thousand. Okay, that's as compared to the same rate for Hispanics as 27.9 per thousand, whites 26.5 per thousand. Native people are 1.5 times more likely to be the victim of a hate crime, or I'm sorry, of violence than African American people. These statistics here specifically address hate crimes being targeted because you are a member of a certain group. They are far beyond the statistics and risks that exist for LGBT community, far beyond the risks that exist in other races, and even by faith. Okay. Between the years 1993 and 2000, there was a special study done, and the annual victimization of Native Americans at that time, they said, let's take a look at these numbers, and let's take out, since it's very unlikely that children under 12 get victimized by a hate crime, because it generally doesn't seem to go that way. And because we know Native people have so many children, so a large part of their population is children, so maybe we're getting a skewed data, right? We're getting skewed data because there's so many children that it's throwing that figure off. So the Bureau of Justice Statistics looked at that data again, and they found that in 1999, they ran that study, and they found that the rate was actually, for adults or people over the age of 12, was 124 per thousand that were victims of hate crimes that were identified as hate crimes. That's more than 1 of 10, right? Hate crimes for Native people went down over a certain period of time, but they became more violent, so more life-threatening. And then over the period of 1993 to 2000, what they also found is that 36% of the natives that were victims of hate crimes were seriously injured. And I'm going to run through this because I want to get to the more hopeful part. Really, I do. So we have continuing trauma that exists. And these are some statistics basically on one simple thing that basically the Bureau of Justice Statistics, when they started tracking this, they found that nationally, over a period of time from the year 2000 forward, around the year 2000 forward, hate crimes in general started to decrease. Okay? And Native people were a part of that decrease also. But then as they began to decrease and continue to decrease over other nationalities, now they're going up toward Native people. So Native people are increasingly a larger part of the statistic of hate crimes, victims of hate crimes. Violence Against Women Act in 2008, it was found in a report that Native women were victims of intimate partner violence, so domestic violence, that as many as 39% of Native women were victims of domestic violence. That also half of the rapes reported by American Indian women were committed by intimate partners. Why would that be? Any ideas about why that might be? Well, non-native partners is a part of it. When you beat down and deny people enough, they become unwilling to see the world as being any different, right? We all see these folks walk through our door every day, don't we? They lose concept of the fact that life could be different. And then what happens is they have this tremendous sense of powerlessness. That sense of powerlessness puts them at extremely high risk for being victimized, doesn't it? Because they've almost given up on some of their defenses. So this tends to also happen with Native people. So American Indian and Native Alaskan people are twice as likely as others to be victims of violent crimes. Native American children, the statistics generally are that 20 out of 1,000 children will be a victim of a violent crime as a child. This is as compared to 10 out of 1,000 for non-native populations. There was a part of that was missing. Does anyone, somebody said something about the non-native partner part of it, okay? That statistic, by the way, is very high amongst Native women. Native women who are victimized through violent acts, there's a very high ratio of those acts that happen with the intimate partner or the partner being non-native. There's a reason for that. On reservations, there's a reason for that. In urban communities, it's a little bit different, but there is a reason, at least at one level. Remember that our reservations, outside of California anyway, for the most part, our reservations have tribal police, we have tribal courts, we have a tribal law enforcement system, right? We do not have the power to arrest or to prosecute anyone who's non-native. So what does that mean? That means that reservations are safe havens for perpetrators. That's not generally known in the public. It's known amongst perpetrators. There are, in the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, which is where those statistics came from, just recently passed. I think it was in 2012 that law passed. It did something that is a hotly contested issue today, and that is in that one instance where there was a violent act against an assault against a Native woman, it gives tribal courts jurisdiction to prosecute someone who's non-native. First time that's ever happened. The Violence Against Women Act, of course, is a large act that impacts, most women in the United States. That held up the passage of the act. That one clause that it would give, that was hotly contested then. It was held up, it was filibustered because of that one clause. Finally, they gave into it, and then now they're trying to there's been some legislative moves to go back and take that away. So you can see how these issues still continue today. We have politicians in Washington, D.C. that are saying, no, these Indian people cannot have the jurisdiction to prosecute non-Indians for crimes. Well, yeah, they're crimes, but they still shouldn't prosecute them. Right? Remember we talked?
I'm sorry, Dr.
Yes.
Martinez. So who prosecutes them?
They have to have committed one of the 10 major crimes under the Major Crimes Act. So there's only 10. And they have to, the investigation has to be done by the FBI because it's a federal crime. It existed on federal lands. And then they have to be prosecuted in federal court. There's no FBI offices on reservations. Okay, so what happens generally is that when there is a violent crime, the tribal police will hold the individual as a citizen's arrest. So they can just they can detain them. They can't detain them overnight, but they can detain them until the FBI can get there and begin an investigation.
Is that a successful process for most cases? Or
In my experience, it is when the person pleads guilty.
So that doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, very rarely. And my experience is a little bit tainted because I see mostly sexual offenses against children. So when they plead guilty, there usually is a successful prosecution. FBI can take up to 2 weeks to show up. Okay. And what tribal police, all the tribal police can do is say, okay, consider yourself under arrest, don't leave town. We have no ability to enforce that, but please don't. So you can see all the issues that come along with that. What are we likely to see from all this? There was another issue I was going to bring up about that. It'll come back later. What are we likely to see? Well, as you can see, this is not one thing that has happened to one people in one generation. Think for a moment what happens when your great-grandmother endured that carnage, right? She barely survived it. And I'm going to say this by grandmas because I come from a matriarchal tribe. And then her daughter went through the next wave, and she survived that. Well, she was raised by a mother who had issues of her own, right? She had her own healing to do. And so she was not able to impart some of the things of keeping yourself well because it was too much of an issue for her. And so now this person that's her daughter is at a little bit, or maybe a lot, more increased risk, aren't they, to be victimized. And guess what happens? She becomes victimized. And then she has children. And then her daughter, the only thing we know is that her daughter is at a little bit more risk to be victimized. But not in a mathematical way of this plus this equals this. It's more of a synergistic way. This times this equals this. So it's a confluence of experiences. And think about how many waves of that violence that we mapped out. How many of you ever treated domestic violence? Okay. What is the first step in treatment? It's amazing how many therapists don't think about this. What is the first step in treatment for someone who's in a domestic violence situation? Absolute first step in treatment. What are you going to do?
Tell them
What's that?
Get them in a safe place. Tell them it's not their fault.
Get them in a safe place. You have to stop the violence, right? Like, it's really hard to, and by the way, I have treated many women who have been victims of domestic violence. And you know what they come to me saying? Native women. They come to me saying, the anti-anxiety medications don't work anymore. Wow, how long have you been taking those? About 10 years. How long have you been in this situation? About 10 years. So when people beat you, you're kind of anxious about that. So you went to a doctor at some point who said, let's treat that anxiety with medication, disarming you from the very things you would need to leave the situation, right? So my editorial note is, let's be careful about medications. What we find is that the very first thing you have to do is find a place of safety, right? You have to stop that violence. Then we can begin to treat things. We can begin to talk about things that put you at risk. We can begin to kind of case management and help you to put parts of your life together. We don't have that advantage in the Native community. You see, we have to continue to treat the trauma while the traumatic experiences continue. So we have some really talented folks in the Native community because this is almost commonplace, right? What are we likely to see from folks that I've just described? Well, we're likely to see the effects of intergenerational traumatic stress are very much like the issues that you will see in post-trauma response, right? So you're very likely to see alcoholism. You're very likely to see drug abuse. By the way, as symptoms of, okay? As symptoms of. So at some level, we tend to treat the substance abuse issues, but fail to recognize that they're a symptom of a larger issue going on. And so if we haven't empowered that person with some safety mechanisms and other things to treat the traumatic stress, it's very likely that issue is going to come back again. Specifically, when I'm trying to get very specific about what you might see with a Native person who had these intergenerational trauma issues. You're also likely to see obsessive thinking, right? What is obsessive thinking? We keep thinking about something over and over and over again in the hopes that we might make it better by thinking it to death, right? And if only that worked. And we've all tried. Come on, you can raise your hand. Okay, so compulsive behavior. What is compulsive behavior? Well, based upon those thoughts, we keep doing something over and over again, hoping that it's going to make life better. And sometimes it doesn't. Okay. Rigid negativity. Rigid negativity meaning just simply that you have an outlook on life that things aren't going to get better, that it's not going to go well. Okay. So it's this pessimistic look at life. And if you have such low self-esteem that you don't believe things are going to go well, what do you think about your children? Yeah, that things aren't going to go well for them either. That's a huge disability for a child. Yeah. Now add to that you think, because of your experiences, that it's something inherent about you, right? This happened to my grandmother. It happened to my mother. It happened to me. There must be something about us, right? What could it be? Well, they know what it is, that they're native. And so they begin to develop this thinking that this happened to me, this will also happen to my children. This is unconscious, right? No one sits around and thinks this stuff up. It's an unconscious response. You'll also see a lot of anger. Somebody mentioned anger earlier. You'll see a lot of anger, and you'll see a lot of the flip side of anger, which is depression. So what is depression generally? Depression is a tremendous amount of anger with an overpowering sense of powerlessness, right? So helplessness to do anything about it. And so where does that anger go? It goes inward. Something's happening. Okay. So what we might do when a native client comes into our office is we might begin to think of a list of risk factors and protective factors, or strengths, right? And in those risk factors, we might want to have some information about their historical trauma issues. They're intergenerational, by the way. So you might want to know a little bit about their family history. You might want to know about their experiences or familial experiences of abuse in placement or boarding school. This is not that you will see this in every client. This is almost a typified list that I would do. I want to know about different parts of their life, but I want to start making a list of the things that stand out. So let's say in this theoretical or hypothetical client that they have, okay, so I've identified that they have some historic trauma issues. I've identified that their grandmother or their mother was abused in boarding school. I've identified that another risk is that they don't have a sense of knowing their own language or their own culture, because we know that culture is a protective factor. We have a sense that they've revealed that they have lifelong experiences of racism or interrupted cultural identity formation, which is kind of a fancy way of saying no one quite let them ever be who they were. Not having connection to their elders might be a risk factor. So I begin to just make lists. This is not something that exists for everyone. This is just a hypothetical client. I would begin to say, well, so I'm talking to them, and I'm mentally or maybe on paper making a list of all their risk issues and all their resilience issues, right? So I'm going down this list, growing up in an unhealthy family environment, or maybe living in a chaotic family environment, okay? Many times you'll find that people are raised in, fairly healthy family environments, but it was just very chaotic. We never knew what was going to happen one day to the next. We want to know other things that contribute to the trauma response. So we've all heard of having trauma-informed care, haven't we? Well, really what we're talking about here is having intergenerational trauma-informed care. So think beyond the experience of that person. Think about the framework within which they were raised and within which they begin to define themselves. We also have some protective factors that we would want to consider. Cultural identity. I identify as a Native person. I think it's a good thing, right? That's a strength. I'm actively involved in their culture, in my culture, and I feel like it makes me proud of who I am. That's a resilient factor. I'm involved in ceremonies, either in the preparation for ceremonies or the participation in ceremonies, or both. That's good. That means that there's a spiritual, they're not only just connecting on an exterior kind of surface level, but on a deeper ceremonial practice level. And maybe they're involved, they have support of their family and tribal community. I feel like my community feels good about me, or they want to see me do well, or that my family wants to see me do well. That's a huge resilience factor, right? It means that people in their family still believe, even if they don't. That there are other people in their family and community still believe in them. So that's a big factor. Do you see how this, by the way, is applicable to other people in the world? Right? Okay. So now we talk about what I tend to term as reparation. How do we begin to reintegrate and repair a spirit? Not an easy job. But, we're all dressed up, showed up to work. What the heck? We're here to help people, right? Something inside of your spirit told you this is something you should do in life. So let's honor that. For Native people, what we're going to find as those 4 elements of reparation, we're not talking about 4 elements of a human being at this point. We're talking about 4 elements of how do we repair these injuries. Okay? So some considerations that we might want to have are sense of spirituality. As in many people that have trauma issues, they find that their ability to redefine themselves spiritually helps, makes a huge difference. Because I can honor that, right? I have purpose-driven life. I'm a part of the solution of life when I am present with my own spirit. Also, what I just termed as anger remediation, which basically means that it's not about having anger management skills. We kind of hope everyone's had anger management skills at some point. But it's about being able to find out what to do with that anger. Okay, now a large part of that is an understanding that anger is absorbing. That anger has a lot of power in it, right? Anyone who's been really angry at some point in their life will tell you that it has a lot of power, right? We've all seen people who have, I've seen people who've broken teeth, right? Their own teeth because they're so angry, they're just clenching their jaw. To help with an understanding of, first of all, that's a solution that generally doesn't work, okay? It also sets the stage for their re-victimization, doesn't it? But also, it's absorbing a lot of their energy. And a lot of their energy, so their sense of themselves is that they don't have this energy. But in essence, anger is absorbing a tremendous amount of their power and their energy, and that's theirs, right? If you look at the things that they're angry about, it's usually about 10% of the stuff, right? It's this really kind of toxic stuff that we can work through in therapy, but I want you to reclaim that other 90%, because that's yours. And then cultural empowerment of our healing practices or our healing people. And by that, basically what I mean is that we find that we build solutions for people based on a foundation of who they are. Who would have thought it? Right? This is a little more than saying strength-based. This is saying that the culture that a person brings into the room is the foundation you start with. That's a resilient factor. You're going to begin to build upon that. Too many times in therapy, what we do is we say, oh, you come in with the culture? That's cool. I actually like those things. So that's not going to be of any use to you here. Let's talk about, your cognitive behavioral process. Or we're going to talk about REBT or something. No, what we need to say is that let's begin to build on that foundation. What has worked for you? Where do we go? What is your experience? How can we empower that? What is our goal? Many times it's rebuilding the lives of shattered families and rebuilding healthy communities. Do not forget that. Remember, we talked originally about a person's ability to engage in a healthy community can be a big part of their recovery and their transformation. So a part of that means that if you're helping someone to be healthy and you're engaging them with a community that's maybe culturally defined of other people that are also doing healthy things, what are you doing? You're empowering that community. You're adding health to that community, right? So you're community building. In many of our reservation communities, we call that nation building. So as we prepare for this journey, there's some things that we want to get some stability in. So we're talking about building on a foundation. Sometimes we have to shore up the foundation, okay? We have to make that foundation stable. How do we do that? First, with sobriety. It's very hard to build a foundation upon continuing substance use. Regaining our spirit through ceremony or through cultural practice. Why? Because we want the empowerment of that to begin to take charge and to take foothold, right? Training our minds to understand the dynamics of oppression, right? That we have been through a lot. That now I begin to understand why Grandma was that way, okay? It wasn't because I was just this person that everyone should hate. It was because she had different experiences in life. And then finding our heart and our feelings and learning to express those in words. What all of us were told in kindergarten, unfortunately, still holds true. Use your words, right? So, when someone's acting out, and they do, we want to be able to kind of guide them to a process where they can, rather than acting out what they're feeling, express into words what they're feeling so that they can see it, so that they can hear it and experience it. So these are all the parts of things. And I know we've kind of rushed through a lot, but as we do that, you're all part of rebuilding of our communities. So you get to be a part of the solution. Okay? That's an important thing to remember when you're treating a Native person. You get to be a part of the solution. There's honor in that. We rekindle our families and our communities of healing. These are important concepts to understand, that you're a part of that rekindling, right? We're putting kindling on a fire. We're building that fire. It's also important to understand that one of my elders coined this term, and it's popularly used within the Native community. Harold Belmont used to always say, the hurt of one is the hurt of all, and the honor of one is the honor of all. And that's how we are as Native people, right? As long as one of us is still suffering, we all still suffer. Supportive networking or cultural participation, right? It's very important. Surround yourself with a healthier network. But also in that, the network of providers, a supportive environment of providers. And typically our case managers are the orchestrators of that, or the coordinators of that. So case management becomes very critical. Case management isn't always done by case managers. Sometimes it's done by substance abuse counselors. Sometimes it's done by therapists. Sometimes it's just whoever shows up, right? So, and then be supportive in your listening, right? support the things that we've talked about that are issues of resilience, and then begin to say, well, maybe we should begin to address the things that are problematic for you. So in that discussion, what I always want to say is that we rarely bring up that's just wrong, right? Because you've just told them, don't talk to me anymore. I can't hear you. So we've gone over a lot. We've gone over a lot of history. You all might need therapy after this. I don't know. But has it kind of brought forward questions, thoughts, ideas? Could you share those with us? Yes.
Earlier, Dr. Martinez, you shared a story about the ceremonial ground where there were lots of cliffs and they would bring the buffalo over to feed them. I think that's what I understood. And to kind of paraphrase this for me, I feel like California is a large ceremony ground, and the Indians are the buffalo to feed them. I mean, I'm paraphrasing.
Very scary thought.
Well, it isn't a thought. There are results. I mean, these are research. These are numbers. And then I thought about the story you shared with us about the grandmother who always had her sack with the dishes, the most important thing for her to take with her. Should they come, the bounty hunters come and take children and the families away. Well, it's still happening with that behavior. I mean, they keep to them what's close to them. They go into these service providers which do not provide the skills. They're not expected to provide the skills because they don't have a standard that says, okay, if you're going to work for this community, if you're going to work for this program, these are the skills that are going to be required to be able to serve these other communities that need something different, not status quo. And it's going to take a little bit more extra time, so we better let you have that. Because when you're doing the evaluation and you're looking at your watch, they're looking at, the more important is the watch. Again, is another symbol of they don't want us here, they don't want to respect us here, and the time is essential to get this history down.
Remember that what all people who have suffered trauma, either in their history or in their personal experience, know is something very simple. They're very accustomed to being marginalized, right? To being held less than. And so they have very sensitive antennas about, oh, okay, I'm not important to you, right? Or you're doing this to hurt me, one of the two. And so they will read that into things that maybe you don't even intend. But nevertheless, that's their understanding of, that's their experience of that. Why? Because they've been down this road too many times. Okay. So your points are well taken. Thank you. Any other thoughts that we have? Yes.
So I was thinking when you were talking about the creation of bands and not recognized as a nation as a whole, the impact of that on the nation and how the bands see each other and become enemies to each other, and also the thought on the hate crimes, on how as Native people we internalize the hate crimes that become self-hate.
Very good point. So did everyone hear that? Basically, what she was pointing out is that imagine the impact of not recognizing a tribe as a whole, but recognizing bands. But you're not just recognizing all the bands, you're recognizing certain selective bands, right? That you've decided to, somebody's decided, that they're going to be recognized. In some communities today, that means they get the casino, right? That's a very small number of people. So just when we're talking about just natives from California, of those that are federally recognized is about 30% of the population. Okay. About 10% of that population participates in casino per capita. Okay, so very small number. When you have when that happens, you create dynamics, don't you? Because now you have one band of people who are probably relatives, and another band of people, one is federally recognized, one is not. I live in a community where that's a living example of that, okay? I'll tell you real quickly. The Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians did not exist as a viable reservation until about the late 1960s. Although they were recognized and they had lands, all of their people were pushed there. They're not originally from there. Their people were forcibly migrated there from downtown Sacramento, where that's where their village originally was. But they were being slaughtered left and right. So the Bureau decided we're going to move them up to this trust land that we have for their own protection. Okay. Why did the Bureau have that trust land? Because there was another portion of trust land that was right next to it that was the El Dorado Miwok Reservation. Okay. The El Dorado Miwok Reservation actually was that entire piece of land. The Bureau just gave away half of it. That caused conflict. Okay. So then the neighbors, the people the ranch holders around them, decided that they would blockade the reservation so that Native people could not get to it. Do you know when that ended? Those forms of blockade in its many different versions? A year and a half ago. A year and a half ago. When the tribe, this will become a famous story at some point. I think they said there's 57 feet that exist between Highway 50 and the boundary of the reservation, right? The Bureau would never give them access to their own reservation. And so they had to spend $57 million to build an off-ramp to get to their reservation. It was $1 million a foot. Remember the El Dorado Miwok people? That their reservation was right next to? That's where the freeway is. So the government just basically came in and said, you know, we decided to build a freeway here, eminent domain, you gotta leave. That's what happened to their reservation. Do you think that didn't cause some conflict? And by the way, we don't recognize your right to exist anymore, because if we did, we couldn't take your reservation away. So therefore, you're federally unrecognized. So it had devastating effects, not only on those two communities, but on their relationship with one another. Those communities were related to one another at one point. So that's just one case in point. And throughout California, we have story after story like that. Yes?
Yes, I have a situation. I supervise 2 staff at Alpine County, and we work in the...
Oh, you're in Alpine County. I used to serve in Alpine County.
I supervise 2 staff. One is Native American, the other is... The point is how we go in there and work with the people in the reservation. That, you know, is there an advantage or disadvantage of having a Native American versus a non-Native American involved in the culture?
It's important. Oh well, there are many levels. One consideration is that there's a certain amount of what we call cultural brokerage, right? I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but it means guidance, basically. Someone who serves as a guide for you in the community, whether they're involved with the case or not. The staffing of the case will allow them to say, you probably shouldn't go about it that way. That's not, that doesn't work. In small communities, though, like I know Alpine County to be, yeah. By the way, in Alpine County, I don't know if you folks know, in Alpine County, Native children are 50% of the school district, right? Huge Native population for such a small county. So there's people often say, well, what is it that one provider can do that a Native provider can't do, right? Well, there's a balance, and the balance is familiarity with the person, because as Native people, we are familiar with each other, right? I know that when I see a client in care, I'm going to run into that client. I'm going to run into powwows, ceremonies, community events. I have to have my head squared, about how I'm going to handle that. In addition, you have that issue of how familiar are they with this person? Are they related to them? They could be their first cousin, right? That could create issues. So you balance that with that's on one side. So there are some kind of things to think about that could be a risk to the therapeutic environment. But there are other things, and that is that the non-Native person, while they might be a good therapist, cannot serve as a role model. And if this person thinks of themselves as someone who cannot embody that health, then it's foreign to them. And so you fight this battle of, could you accept yourself to be this way? Well, obviously, we must not be entitled to be this way because you're not Native, right? If I see a person who's Native who tells me that, then maybe I, might understand it. So you have this balancing, and it's really about role modeling, okay? And then regard. Regard meaning that they don't see you as a risk. They see you as someone who could be an important part of their healing. And those are things that you just have to weigh almost with every case and every family. The communities that exist look around very carefully to see the risks in your community that still exist, because that is critically important. In Alpine County, I probably shouldn't tell this story. In Alpine County, I came in to see some kids in the school. Very hard, complex cases. But I also found out that the school counselor would tell me that none of the children would talk to her. I thought, that's kind of interesting. There's 50% of the children won't talk to you. I'd be concerned about that. And I said, well, we talked a little bit about what that might be about. And I could see that there were obvious cultural differences. Until I sat one day in the superintendent's office with her. And we were talking about issues, how to improve lives in children. And I went to one of the family's homes. I went, saw the children, and they said, well, we can arrange an escort for you. We can arrange for the police to be around when you do these things. And I said, wow, didn't seem necessary. Hadn't thought of it. I said, well, do you feel that way sometimes? Like, families are a threat to you? They go, oh yeah, we both carry sidearms in the school. There's a whole nother page I hadn't thought of, right? So they felt so threatened by the Native community that they carried guns. Imagine your counselor sitting armed. That'd be a new experience for me. And I don't think I'd want to go there. So that was many years ago, by the way. Yeah, those folks hopefully are not around today. So that's a reality that many of our children kind of live within. And it's something that we have to constantly be aware of. What are the signs that people could be responding to here? What are the undercurrents that we're not aware of? And why? Because we need to create a place of safety if anyone's going to get better. So thank you for your questions. Good question. All right. Well, I see we're out of time. I'd just like to thank everybody for being here today and being such a wonderful audience. You're all, we're videotaping this. I hope you knew that, for a webinar that will be part of the MHSA efforts throughout the state. And so it will be used as a training model for other counties and other areas. So also feel free to contact me if I can consult, be of any assistance. You just have a case you want to run by me. feel free. And I believe my contact information is in your materials somewhere. If not, there are cards here. So thank you.